Here are the top 10 mistakes people make in their fantasy football drafts, starting off with a comment that inspired this, where someone said, LOL, I can't believe you're ranking 3 Texans wide receivers before the first Carolina Panther. And I've seen a lot of people have this sentiment, thinking just because you have a wide receiver 1 in an NFL offense, that player is going to be viable in fantasy. That could not be further from the truth. What we actually did earlier this offseason in an in-depth research piece as we went over the past 10 years and I looked at the wide receiver 1 for the 5 highest scoring offenses every season over the past 10 years. And I looked at the wide receiver 1 for the lowest 5 scoring offenses every year over the past 10. We actually tracked where they finished in fantasy football. And what we found was in the bottom 5 offenses, out of that sample of 50 wide receivers, 0 finished inside the top 9. Only 2 finished inside the top 12, only 8 finished as top 24 options, and only 26 finished as top 36 pieces. Whereas if you go over and you look at wide receivers that finish in top 5 offenses, there you had 12 guys finishing inside the top 3. Yes, if you are looking at the wide receiver 1 for an elite offense, they are more likely to be a top 3 option in fantasy football than the wide receiver 1 in a very bad offense is to just be a top 24 option in fantasy. We can even look at this a different way and look at the wide receiver 1s from different offenses last year and look at where they finished in fantasy. I mean, you had Kendrick Bourne for the Patriots being the wide receiver 34. You had the Giants with Darius Slayton being the wide receiver 50. The Jets with Garrett Wilson, who I want to say is a great talent, wide receiver 40. The Steelers with George Pickens, he was only wide receiver 33. Drake London with the Falcons was wide receiver 46. Terry McLaurin with Washington was wide receiver 37. Hollywood Brown with the Cardinals was wide receiver 56. And Cortland Sutton with the Broncos was wide receiver 36. So for the love of God, don't just think, oh, okay, he's the wide receiver 1 in this offense. That means he's going to be viable in fantasy. It could not be further from the truth. And these wide receiver 1s in bad offenses, yes, should be ranked lower than the secondary options in very good offenses. Don't be the guy thinking Deontay Johnson should be taken ahead of Tank Dell. Now, going over to our next mistake, seeing people draft a second quarterback or a second tight end. Now, obviously, I want to put an asterisk on here. This is primarily for the teams where you go and draft Josh Allen, you go and draft Jalen Hurts, you have Mahomes, you have Lamar, you have Anthony Richardson, you have one of these guys that you had to take inside the first 5 rounds of your fantasy football draft. And I think it makes a lot of sense to take an elite level quarterback there. But once you make that type of investment, that'll be a quarterback that you're going to be starting every single week, regardless of matchup. And it makes no sense to waste a second roster spot on another quarterback in the tier of someone like Bryce Young, in the tier of someone like Daniel Jones, even Aaron Rodgers, Baker Mayfield, Matthew Stafford. Those guys are going to be better on the waiver wire. If you have an injury to Josh Allen, you can then go to the waiver wire and stream the position. During your bye week, you can then go to the waiver wire and pick someone up for the week. But instead, at the bottom end of your roster, you want to use those extra spots for running backs that have high ceilings. We'll talk about that a little more in depth just one second. And then same thing at tight end. If you draft Laporta, if you draft Kelsey, if you take McBride, if you take Kincaid, if you take Mark Andrews, if you take one of those top tight ends that you're going to be starting regardless of matchup, the added on value that they give you is you get the additional roster spot at the bottom end of your bench to pick up an extra running back with upside. So please don't draft a second quarterback or a second tight end if you take a top option. Now, of course, with that being said, if you wait till the very end of your draft where you decide, you know what, I actually figured out I can get Tua in round 13, then at that point, sure, go 2 in round 13, take Trevor Lawrence in round 14, and play the matchups between those two guys. But this will be specifically for those people who take a quarterback early. And the second thing is, with these onesie positions, looking at kicker and defense. For the love of God, don't take a kicker or defense inside the first 10 rounds. I will say you don't have to wait till the last 2 rounds in your league. If you have the option to take an elite level DST, specifically about 3 or 4 rounds before your draft ends, and you're able to go get the Niners, you're able to go get the Dallas Cowboys, at that point, taking that elite option may make sense because you're in the portion of the draft where we assume that the vast majority of those players in the last 3 to 4 rounds will eventually be going to the waiver wire within the first month of the season. So in that range, you can get an elite level defense. You can even take a top kicker if you want. Personally, I think it's so hard to predict kickers. I would rather just stream it, take the guy in round 18 regardless. But just please don't be taking a DST in round 8, in round 9. I haven't seen that in some Yahoo leagues. Now, the next mistake we're looking at is people drafting as if they have to fill out their starting lineup. Now, I think understanding your league format is going to be crucial. We'll pay attention to that in just one second. But one thing that I have noticed is people, when they first get into fantasy football, especially with the way that these draft platforms are laid out, they'll go through, they'll take 2 running backs, they'll maybe take another running back for the flex, and then they see that, oh, my wide receiver 2 slot's empty. Even though my favorite player on the board right now is running back, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take a wide receiver 2 because I quote unquote need the position. I think that is a very bad way to go about it. Please do not draft specifically to fill in your starting lineup in your draft and then work your way down to the bench. Instead, you want to be having an overall well-balanced roster construction. It doesn't matter exactly how you get there. That may mean if running back's great value for you in your particular draft at rounds 3, 4, 5, maybe you take 3 running backs there and have to load up on high upside wide receivers at the end for your bench. But just don't go through and think, oh, okay, I have 2 running backs. Now I need to pivot over to a wide receiver. Now, this one is the most important mistake here. A couple of these other ones are very basic, but not paying attention to the small details with your league settings. If you are looking at the vast majority of questions I get in the comment section, here is how that question is structured. Hey, Mason, I got pick 8. What do I do? Mason, I'm picking at 9. What's the move? Guys, it is going to be wildly dependent on specifically your exact league settings. I covered this in depth in a full-blown video talking about exploiting your league mates with understanding this. But just to give a little bit of insight there, we are going to be basing everything off a league where you only start 2 wide receivers and 1 flex, and then obviously a quarterback, 2 running backs, tight end, defense, kicker, blah, 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 blah. Really, we're focusing on wide receivers and a flex because that's where people are going to be changing their league settings. And if you deviate where you bump up, where you start 3 wide receivers instead of 2, there you want to go a little more wide receiver heavy. If you add on the additional flex spots, their quarterback and tight end are going to be less important in your draft because they're going to make up a lower percentage of your starting lineup. If you go from PPR to non-PPR, quarterbacks are going to be bumped up dramatically because their scoring is going to be so high compared to the other positions, and running back value is going to jump up dramatically as well. So just general overview, the more wide receiver and flex spots you have, the more wide receiver is going to matter and the less quarterback and tight end will. The fewer flex spots that you have, then the more quarterback and tight end will matter. And the more you get points per reception, whether that's full or half, the less running back's going to matter and the more wide receiver will. Hopefully that makes sense for everybody. And obviously, if you're seeing me draft on the live stream every single night, understand I'm drafting on Underdog. It's very different than your regular redraft league because they are best ball drafts. I definitely think drafting over there can be great practice for your main league. You just can't copy my draft strategy 1 for 1. But of course, you can draft against me in an Underdog draft. They're best ball, so there's no time commitment at all during the season. So I draft hundreds of teams every year. So I won $150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. And if you wanted to hop in a draft with me, you can find that link in the description, in the comment section. If you use code FLOCK, you're going to be getting a 50% deposit bonus up to $250. You're going to be getting my 2024 rankings, 2024 draft guide, and 2024 ADP consensus cheat sheet, all 3 of which will be updated every Sunday and sent to you via email for whatever email address you signed up to Underdog with. And if you use code FLOCK, you're going to get a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em, more than less than half a total yards. So make sure you take advantage of that. Now, our next mistake I see people make is drafting injured/suspended players when you cannot put them on the IR. Now, I know a lot of people with their commissioners have already set it up where if a player's on the PUP or the player's listed as out, then you can go through and you can put them on your IR. So that's a perfect league to go through and take someone like Jonathan Brooks, go through, take someone like Nick Chubb, go through, take someone like TJ Hawkinson that has a very high ceiling in the second half of the year. However, in the first half of the season, we're assuming that they're not really going to make a difference based off the injuries that they're coming off of. However, if you're playing in a format where you're not able to put those players on the injured reserve, and you were to go through and say, hypothetically, draft Jonathan Brooks in round 9, then all of a sudden you're going to have to lock him into your bench for the first half of the season, and you're going to be extremely limited because you're essentially going to have 1 fewer roster spot than everybody else in your league. This is going to essentially tie a hand behind your back when you try to go to the waiver wire, pick guys up. So yeah, if you're playing in a league where you can go through and you can throw an injured player on the IR, I would actually advocate, please draft Jonathan Brooks, please draft Nick Chubb, because you get to put him on your IR at pretty much a free cost and have an extra roster spot through the first half of the season. but just make sure you understand your league settings there. Now, speaking of the bottom end of your roster, just rostering guys that are going to be clogging that bench is going to be a bad idea in general. Now, typically the strategy that you want to be taking in is looking at the bottom end of your bench, especially going into the season, as a spot where we need to be focusing on upside, upside, upside. And a lot of people make the mistake thinking that upside, upside, upside means, oh, okay, I'm just going to go take all the rookies. Oh, okay, that means I can just take, let's say, Jermaine Burton. That just means I can go through and take Adonai Mitchell. That just means I can go through and take these wide receivers like Jalen McMillan. And while maybe they have upside through their NFL careers, the issue is if you're grabbing those guys that you're banking on late season upside, they're going to be horrendous players at the beginning of the year for you. Because let's go through the hypothetical situation where you draft Jermaine Burton. What is going to change from August 15th to September 15th to give us clarity on Burton? He's going to come out and maybe he plays a little bit in Cincinnati early in the season. Maybe he has one or two flashy plays where you get excited and you go, okay, he does have upside for the second half of the year. I'm going to hold him down here on my bench and see if he turns into anything. And then all of a sudden, you've gone halfway through the season. You're just looking at him on your bench and you have not been able to make really any waiver wire moves. And he's still about equivalent of a player that you would get off waivers. So instead of just thinking, oh, rookie wide receiver, this is somebody that has upside, you're much better off looking at guys that we are going to get clarity on at the beginning of the season. Somebody that you would feel comfortable if you needed to cut them after week one if you did not like their role. A great example of this is instead of going through and taking Adonai Mitchell at the bottom end of your bench, taking instead somebody like J.K. Dobbins will be the perfect guy to look at, because if we go through the first 2 weeks of the season and J.K. Dobbins turns out to be the running back 3 in Los Angeles, super easy. You cut him off your team. You don't have to think about it twice. Whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, if J.K. Dobbins turns out to have a large role here, you go, okay, hell yes, we hit on this guy. He's clearly worth the roster spot. He clearly does have a lot of upside, and you get that clarity immediately. Just don't be taking those guys that are going to have long runways, specifically those rookie wide receivers at the bottom end of your bench. Now, clearly, there's going to be a big difference between the top prospects that were selected in round 1 of the NFL draft that have all the upside in the world. Guys like Xavier Worthy, Keon Coleman, Brian Thomas, Ladd McConkey. I know a couple of those guys were round 2 picks, but nonetheless at the top of round 2. But those guys, don't assume that I'm calling them roster cloggers. Those are players that we should see a role from almost right away and could be in your starting lineup by the time we get to week 3. Now, the other mistake that I've noticed people looking at will be caring about their bye weeks. Now, don't get me wrong. Sometimes a bye week's going to matter, but just based off how it's set up in your fantasy football draft, where the only information that you are getting at the time that you decide to select a player is going to be that player's name, is going to be that player's team, and that player's bye. So what I've found is it seems like people go through and just all of a sudden think that the bye week is something they have to be paying attention to, where in reality, say in your redraft league, you go through and you draft a bunch of guys that are in a week 12 bye. Do you have any idea how many waiver wire moves you're going to make from now to week 12? Any idea how many trades you could potentially make during that time? Your roster is going to look dramatically different by the time we get to that portion of the season, where it doesn't matter if you took 5 guys that have a week 12 bye. It doesn't matter if you took 6 guys that have a week 12 bye. You need to be worried at the beginning of the year. You need to be worried about guys that have long-term upside as well. So please don't be caring about the bye weeks. Maybe Underdog is going to be a little bit different because obviously Underdog, you're not making moves during the season. So if you just take everybody on a week 12 bye, you're kind of screwed in week 12. But that's not what this video is for. Now, the last mistake I see people making is thinking that they need to handcuff their running backs. Now, don't get me wrong. Running backs like Tyler Algier have extremely high ceilings, right? I mean, if you were to get a Bijan Robinson injury, all of a sudden Tyler Algier could come out and he could be a top 10 running back in fantasy. And that's somebody that's worth a roster spot. But you don't want to go ahead and take Bijan Robinson round 1 and go, okay, now I need to get Tyler Algier, because what if Bijan Robinson gets hurt? I have news for you. If you're in a 12-team league and you're an average drafter, you have an 8.3% chance of winning your league. You have to have things go right for you. You pretty much have to have Bijan Robinson to stay healthy if you want to have a good shot winning your league. Even if you are twice as good as the average fantasy football player. Instead of having an 8% chance to win your league, you have a 16.5, 17% chance to win your format. So don't draft to raise your floor. Instead, you want to draft to raise your ceiling. So maybe on a team where you take Breece Hall, there you go grab Tyler Algier instead of drafting Braylon Allen, because you'll go, okay, Bijan Robinson goes down and Tyler Algier is the running back 10. I get to put him next to Breece Hall and I have a juggernaut team. So chasing the handcuff running backs of your own team, while it's going to raise your floor, it's probably going to lower your ceiling because you are tying a bench spot up to just essentially one starting lineup spot. And even if your round one pick goes down, you're probably going to lose regardless. It's not like Algier would be as productive as what you would get with Bijan. Now, if you were to instead look at grabbing two running backs that are in, say, a murky backfield where we don't exactly know what to expect and they are at cheap cost, say you draft like Zach Moss in round 8 and then Chase Brown in round 9, that's going to be very different, right? Because if Zach Moss goes down and Chase Brown turns out to be a top 12 running back in fantasy, then all of a sudden you can crush at that cost in particular, because who cares if your round 8 pick went down? So you can take running backs from the same backfield. Just don't feel like you need to go out of your way and handcuff your round 1 and 2 running backs with their backups later on. Unless you're in a league where last place has some massive punishment, like you have to get a tattoo or something, then sure, just make sure you don't lose the league. But I think that's all I have for you. Again, thank you so much for checking out this video. I really hope I was able to help you out in some way here. If you have not done so already, go down there, drop that like, subscribe if you play fantasy football. And if you want to get in a draft with us, I'll be streaming every single night, including tonight. Underdog Fantasy, their best balls to no time commitment during the year. So I draft hundreds of teams every year. It's I won 150,000 on Underdog 2 years ago. That link's in the description, comment section. Use code FLOCK and you'll get my 2024 rankings, draft guide, 2024 ADP consensus cheat sheet, 50% deposit bonus up to $250, and a Christian McCaffrey special pick'em more than less than half a total yard. And also, we have the Flock meetup coming very soon, August 22nd, Austin, Texas. If you have not got your ticket yet, flockfantasy.store. Should be a ton of fun, giving away a ton of free merch, half price beer there. I'm really looking forward to hanging out with y'all and all the other fantasy football YouTubers that will be there. But thank you again. Really do appreciate you. Really hope you have a great day, and really hope I get to see you out in a live stream sometime soon.